of UKIP.
Good evening, everybody. I'll try and speak without the mic. Can you hear me out the back? If you can't, just wave your arms and I know I'm not speaking loud enough. Now, I'd like to thank Patrick very much indeed for organising this meeting. Tonight he's done a series of these around his constituency, and it's a great initiative on behalf of UKIP MEPs, and this one in particular, to actually bring the message out to people in these meetings. So thank you very much for doing that, Patrick. Now, where to start? I mean, it's difficult to know where to start with all this, but one thing I think we have to say is that Brexit doesn't mean Brexit. Brexit means exit. It means leaving the European Union, and it doesn't mean anything else. Patrick's touched on a lot of the things that I want to cover, but of course the first thing I want to say is Mrs May is not looking for a way out of the European Union. She's looking for a way of disguising the fact that she doesn't really want to leave and doesn't intend to deliver it, but hoping that nobody is going to notice. Well, let's go back a little bit, shall we? We know that the European Union withdrawal bill has been passed through Parliament, and we're supposed to be leaving on the 29th of March 2019. So that would seem to be all done and dusted. It's not quite like that, and I'm going to come back to that later on. Now, Patrick was quite right. The only reason that we got the referendum was because of the UKIP electoral threat built up over the previous 23 years. A hard struggle from untold thousands of people who dedicated time, effort and money to fighting local elections, assembly elections, European elections, by-elections, general elections. And it got to the stage where Cameron knew, after the 2015 election, when we got, I think, 12.9% of the vote, that UKIP was an electoral threat. And of course, in that election, we got more votes than the Scottish National Party and the Liberal Democrat Party put together. They got, I think, 62 seats, and we got one seat, Douglas Carswell, God help us. How is that a fair voting system? Obviously it's not, because if it was, we would have had UKIP MPs a very long time ago, and the country would be in a completely different place where it is now. It wouldn't be a number of DUP MPs influencing the outcome of this. It would be UKIP MPs who know exactly what they want and know exactly how to get it. But Cameron realised that he had to do something to placate this groundswell in the country of people who wanted to leave. So he promised a referendum. And I don't believe that either he or the political establishment ever thought, or the media establishment, come to that, ever thought that the Leave side would win. But they did, and I must admit, I started campaigning back in the October of 2015. We started going out street stalls and doing things, and as it got on, my confidence built that we could actually win. Closer we got to referendum day, I thought that, yeah, we're going to do it. But then you had this relentless Project Fear going on, and I began then to feel that that fear was taking a hold on the British public. And in the last week, of course, you had the disgraceful, disgusting murder of Joe Cox, which was exactly what I've just described it as, disgraceful and disgusting. But what was even more disgraceful and disgusting was the way that the media used that to try, as a weapon in the referendum campaign, to try and make that reflect on the Leave side. And I must admit, on the day of the referendum itself, I was a little bit despondent. I didn't think we'd win. I didn't think we wouldn't win, but I was, let's say that I was not as confident as I had been just 2 or 3 weeks before. Went to bed, overslept, jumped out of bed, I should have been at the count, ran down, well, my assistant rang me up, have you seen the result? We've won. And by not a bad percentage, actually, considering the campaign that had been waged. And I think that came as a complete and total shock to, obviously, to Mr. Cameron, to the political establishment, to the media establishment, and all the political parties who campaigned to remain. And of course he promised that he would stay and deliver the result. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Well, like a lot of promises, that didn't materialise, and he left pretty quickly. And then of course we got Mrs May. And Mrs May is a Remainer, and it's a bit like putting an arsonist in charge of the fire brigade. She didn't want to leave, and then she's like a rabbit in the headlights. The entire establishment afterwards, certainly how I perceived it, they were thinking desperately to themselves, how are we going to make this not happen? And I'm sure that they must have gone off to the European Union and had talks with them about what the hell do we do next? How do we make sure that this isn't delivered? And of course for the first 6 months they didn't do anything at all. Article 50 wasn't triggered until the March of 2017, when I think Mr Davis was in position by that time, in charge of the leaving process, and he, like so many, has gone since because he realised that the whole thing was a farce and wasn't happening. And during that time, during those last 2 years and 4 months since the referendum, we have had a relentless propaganda campaign in the mainstream media. BBC, Channel 4, Sky. I can't watch it anymore. I've almost stopped watching the news bulletins now. I watch the headlines, you know, what's the main stories. You know how they're going to report them, so there's no point in listening to them. You can do it yourself. You know exactly how they're going to present the story. And of course we've had this relentless campaign telling us that it's all too dreadful, you know, you won't be able to get meat in your sandwiches, all kinds of things. Nothing was too absurd to actually bring up. But remember what was said by the party leaders back then. Cameron said it, Clegg said it, Osborne said it. This is a once-in-a-lifetime vote. It will not be reneged on. We will do what you vote for. They all promised that. And they promised it because they thought that would frighten people into voting Remain. Well, it didn't work, and they voted to leave. And now, of course, they were stuck with the problem of how to deliver it. And of course, as I said, there was this relentless Project Fear. I'm just trying to remember some of the main highlights of that. I think Mr Osborne said it would cost every family about £4,300 per year or something. Do you remember that one? We wouldn't be able to trade with the countries of the European Union because, as we all know, countries cannot trade with each other unless they're members of the European Union. Nobody's told the Chinese or the Russians or the Japanese or the South Koreans, etc., of course, but anyway. And of course, World War III was likely to start. That was the best one. That was the one I enjoyed most.
Climate change would increase.
Oh yes, there were so many. I can't possibly remember them all. And of course now, since then, we've had Project Fear 2, which is even better. I mean, that is relentless on the news, the mainstream media, in the newspapers, especially on the broadcast media and the TV. The wall will be built across Ireland. Nobody's quite sure who's going to build this wall. Well, I think he's got his building cut out across America. I think he's got other things on his mind. I mean, I don't know whether they're going to bring over some Polish builders to do it, quite possibly.
We run out of paddies.
But there's going to be a wall built. Terrorism will resume, of course, in Northern Ireland because they're going to be so upset about leaving the European Union that they must go back to the Troubles. We've been told that. You'll need a visa to go on holiday to France, of course. There will be no fillings for your sandwiches. That one's still and who knows? World War III might actually break out. Yeah, who can tell? So are we actually going to leave? Well, back in 2014, I wrote a little book called The Road to Freedom. And at that point, a referendum was being promised. It was on the cards that we might have one. And I said, this is what will happen if there is a referendum and if Leave wins. They will delay and they will impede the whole process as much as possible in the hope of not delivering it and overturning that result in a referendum. And I also laid out why it's perfectly permissible to us to leave unilaterally, unconditional withdrawal under our own law and under international law. So there was no problem with actually seizing the initiative and doing it ourselves. And I said that Article 50 was a trap. Prior to Article 50 in the Lisbon Treaty, then there was no way of a country formally leaving the European Union. And the great danger for that, for the European Union, was any country that wanted to leave would just have to say, well, okay, we're leaving under our law. Goodbye. So by having Article 50 and having this process laid out, which is supposed to take 2 years, you gave valuable breathing space to the politicians in that country and to the European Union to actually reverse any decision that a country might have made, and all kinds of ways of putting up impediments. But Article 50 does exist. It was eventually triggered, and of course they put entirely the wrong people, from our point of view, in charge of it. Because if a country has decided to leave, that process should have been decided by the Council of the European Union, which is the heads of government. And you would expect them to say, well, the people of Britain have made a democratic choice and it's up to us now to put people in charge of the process to make sure it happens. Instead of that, they put it under the control of the European Commission, Mr. Juncker and his acolytes, who are the very people who would have least interest in making it happen. Why would they? And this whole thing about this mythical deal that we're supposed to get, there never was going to be a deal. Because why would there be? They don't want us to leave. And yet we've had Mrs May and her ministers constantly going to Brussels to say, oh, how may we leave, please? Well, what kind of an answer do you think you're going to get? Oh, it's much too difficult. Oh, you know, this is too difficult, that's too difficult. And this is why we're still where we are 2 years and 4 months later. In 2016, I actually worked up that little book into a full exit plan, which I produced along with the help of some of my colleagues. And UKIP was the only party, the only political party that produced an exit plan and said how it should work. And I'll go into that detail a little bit further on. And what has Mrs May succeeded in doing? Well, we've had the to in and fro. We have had the withdrawal bill, which has been passed. And what she intended in Chequers, which was actually very bad enough, but was rejected by the EU, she wanted, as Patrick has said, we continue paying them money, we continue being under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, we continue obeying their regulations, and of course we'd have more or less open borders. And what Mrs May does, she's marvellous, Mrs May. I've been on a platform with her. I actually ran against her in the Maidenhead constituency in the last general election. I got the magnificent percentage of about 1.9%. But I did enjoy it. And I was on the platform with her. And what she does, which is absolutely superb, which is she speaks and it means nothing. The words come out and you listen to them, and afterwards you have no idea what she said or what it meant, and it all's instantly forgotten afterwards because it doesn't actually mean anything. What she intended, and what I've always said that she intended to do, is to reach a withdrawal agreement where we don't really leave, where we continue to pay them lots of money, we continue to obey lots of their laws, and where we have more or less open borders. And if you want to know what that looks like, you only have to look at Switzerland and Norway, who are not members of the European Union because their people keep rejecting it in referendums. But what their political class has done is agreed a series of bilateral agreements with the European Union where they all have this stuff anyway. They pay them money. They obey a large percentage of their laws, roughly 25% last time I checked, and they have more or less open borders. And what did the Swiss do? They said that a couple of years ago they had one of their referendums, which they're obliged to do under their constitution, which said they didn't want such a massive amount of immigration, and that they were, told their government to stop it. And what did the EU say? They said, well, if you do this, we will foreclose on our 100 or so bilateral agreements with you. And what's happened in the last 2 years or so since they had that referendum? Nothing. They still haven't controlled their borders because the EU told them that they couldn't. Chequers was bad enough, but even the EU said that's not good enough for them. They rejected it. And Mrs May and her ministers go and get sent back like a school child that's getting its homework wrong and just can't get it right, and they keep going up to the teacher's desk and putting it in, sorry, red mark, you've got to go away and do it again. And this is what Mr. Juncker, the unelected President of the Commission, and Mr. Tusk, the President of the Council, unelected to those positions, at least by the people, keep on doing. They keep on sending her back and telling her it's not good enough. And the story goes, of course, that she was absolutely desperate. It was in the media recently that she was absolutely desperately trying to get them to accept checkers and trying to explain that that was about the best that she could squeeze out of her reluctant ministers, and they still rejected it, and they still sent her back. The withdrawal agreement actually is long overdue. This should have been sorted out by the middle of October, because the European Parliament Constitutional Affairs Committee did a report on this at least a year, 18 months ago, which I read, which said that this agreement had to be reached by now, because if it wasn't, they can't properly prepare for the European elections, because they have to know who's taking part and who's not. And yet we're still there. We're now at the end of October. We're going to be in November next week, and we still don't have a withdrawal agreement. But we have got a withdrawal bill, so I suppose you all think we're going to leave on the 29th of March, because I did. Even I thought, you know, it's in black and white. It's in the withdrawal bill. It's clause 1. Exit day will be the 29th of March. And then one of our brilliant researchers came to me the other day, and he said, you need to read the appendix. And let me tell you what it says. It's in a legal